Daily Solutions Podcast. Podcast. Daily Solutions. This is the Daily Solutions Podcast.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Graham.
My name is Ashkan.
And today's question is, how do I get local media to cover my center?
Nice.
Question mark, exclamation point.
Exclamation point?
I just added that
Oh,
in for
okay.
comedic
All
effect.
right.
They didn't.
Well,
they weren't that demanding.
Let's not get all alarmed here. It's a good question.
Yeah. So you should probably reach out to them and make sure that they know about you.
I mean, that's basically the crux of it. You gotta reach out there and make sure they know. I mean, so there's some media that'll just contact you.
Yeah, and if that happens, at least in our experience, the chances of them running a story is humongous.
Oh yeah, if they reach out to you.
Float tanks are interesting enough. It almost doesn't even matter if you bomb an interview or something. They still want to cover it and they want it for something. So call that the winning the lottery strategy of getting media coverage is just wait around for someone to reach out to you. And on the flip side, right, it takes some active outreach on your part to actually get people to know that you exist, A, and want to take the time to write a story on you, B.
And the short story is it's kind of a tough racket. It's not it's not a very two-way conversation most of the time. A lot of it is just feeling like you're tossing stuff into the void and that's it. Yeah. I mean, it's true. It's and that's why it can be a little hard to talk about. Sometimes it's hard to even know what worked and what didn't exactly.
So one thing I will say is it's a numbers game, right? If you really want to get covered by a certain local paper or your biggest local paper, and so you send out a press release or you make up a press kit and send it out to them, you're probably not going to get covered. Right? For here in Portland, we have a media list of about 50 different media outlets, from small-time blogs to actual TV stations to the kind of big weekly papers that we have, radio. And between all of those, we have this kind of 50 organization list of people who we submit our media press releases to each time we want to get covered. And of those, maybe 5% or something will actually run a story on you. From every time we really blanket them hard, we'll maybe get 3 or 4 little articles and possibly something that's a big piece. But even that is really a gamble. So it's a numbers game. Don't get one-itis and just be focused on a single media outlet that you want.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like we've had more success kind of working with smaller publications. I mean, which makes sense. But it is a nice place to start because it helps build momentum. And stuff like that, it works pretty well in kind of the PR world, it seems. When you there's a circuit that seems to exist, and having an article written about you one place seems to make it more likely that you'll have an article written about you somewhere else. So even starting with, instead of reaching out to your local news channel, starting with local bloggers or people who are just a little bit more hungry for content and don't have as much of a bombardment of people contacting them.
Yeah, starting small and building up is a great idea. And even including examples from the previous press that you've gotten when you're contacting bigger press is really good. Maybe they'll see something in one of those articles that's kind of an angle that they can take that they hadn't thought of before, or just showing how other people have written about it is nice for bigger publications.
Yeah. And
so the actual process here that we're kind of talking about is preparing a press release, which is usually about 300 words. And that's something that you'll send out to your giant master media list. Or you can also prepare something, which is what I prefer, called a press kit, right? Which includes more photos, maybe examples of previous press, some sheets just of info about floating and float tanks that they might not know, but isn't exactly in your press release itself. And because float tanks are so weird and people don't know about them, and because they look interesting and you can include some really good photo references, a press kit is totally what I recommend doing. And so that might be anywhere between 8 to 10 pages long with a lot of images scattered in there.
And the release itself, the press release, you kind of want to write as if you're writing the article. It's basically the more work you can save these people from doing, the more likely they'll be oh, maybe I'll run this story. Look, there's a bunch of this work is already done for me.
Yep, so you're writing it as though you're one of the paper's reporters or the news broadcasters that's going to be covering it.
Right.
And along those lines, too, when you do write your press release, don't just make it about you. Like the more the story is just about a local float tank center that's opening up, the more that I think this thing that people call journalistic integrity kicks in, and they're like, I just don't want to just be promoting this business with my news article, right? And so the more you can be part of a bigger movement, I think the better for your chances of getting published.
Yeah, and just look at almost any float article that's out there that you can get your hands on, and it's almost always about floating as a concept and its popularization recently, and the benefits it can have for people and stuff like that. And then in there they mention, and here's a float center in our town. I don't know, I've almost never seen an article that's just like about a float center, and that's what
maybe
it's
like
about.
in the business section where it's like local entrepreneur does crazy new thing.
Right.
But yeah, for the most part, right? And so you have two really good topics right there that you can kind of wedge yourself into. One is just the rising tide of float tanks across the country in that movement. And the other one is even broader, which is the movement of mindfulness and meditation and just taking time out of your daily life to process. And that also is getting kind of a lot of traction across the national media and even international media, especially as new studies come out on meditation and the benefits thereof. So, making your float tank center part of either of those greater concepts is way more likely to get a bite from the media than just making it about your center.
Yep. Okay, so you have your press release, it's in your press kit, and then what do?
Then you blanket everyone. So send it out to that list of 50 people you have. And from here on out, the name of the game is really about follow-up. If all you do is send out your press kit or press release to those 50 people and kind of say like, all right, done with that, don't need to touch it again, you're likewise probably not going to get a hugely good result. Like these people get tons of press releases. I mean, you're like probably one of 50 or 100 press releases that they got that day if you're in a larger city, right? So actually getting them to pay attention and stand out becomes the next big step. And that's, in my mind, all about follow-up. So, after a few days, once you've emailed them, email them again with some more pictures. And this is also a good lesson, which is don't just email them and say like, hey, did you get my press release? Because they totally did, and they totally didn't care, or they would have gotten back to you. And so the next step is, like, rather than saying, did you get this, send them something else that's useful. Be like, oh, just so you know, like, here's a little video interview I did with one of my floaters in case this is useful for you. Or here's some high-res photos of my tanks, just in case you need that for your article, or something like that is a much better approach for follow-up. And, over the course of a few weeks, follow up a few times like that. Give them a phone call maybe once. And almost every time you won't hear anything back still, right? You're like giving them more photos, you're giving them a phone call to see if they want an interview with one of your clients, or if they want free floats. Offering free floats is always one of those good kind of follow-ups that you can throw in there. And again, it'll probably be radio silence. And most likely what'll happen is after you've done this 4 or 5 times over a few weeks, one of your customers will come in and say like, oh, I really like that article that popped up in so-and-so magazine. And you're like, what? Like, what are you talking about? And they pull it out, and sure enough, there's the press release that you wrote that popped up in a magazine with someone else's name attached to it. And they wouldn't even have told you that they were going to publish it. And that's almost always been our experience and of other float tank centers. Yeah. Which is really interesting. So, like, what the heck is going on there?
I mean, I've even been interviewed for news articles, and they don't tell you when they actually come out or anything. Like, you just find them eventually. You're like, wait a minute, what? It's my name in there.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And so, we don't know for sure what's going on, but my theory is that the people writing the article never intended to publish it. They might have done a follow-up interview if they had a float-specific piece they wanted to do, but what happened was they were fact-checking some piece and it didn't quite pan out, or a big advertiser fell out at the last second, and all of a sudden they have these inches of column space that they need to fill by their print deadline, which is maybe 2 or 3 days from then. And so they're just scouring through their brain and through their archives for a piece that's well put together, that already has references that they can slap in there, and which is probably interesting to their readership, right? And so the more that you've been on their mind, and the more you foot that bill, the more that you're able to actually be well-written and have good photo documentation and not be so self-promotional that it's all about you, the more that you're what pops to mind and you end up in that magazine. Again, this is just my theory and from talking to PR people, but it certainly the lack of response, the lack of follow-through, almost the lack of fact-checking that goes into a lot of these articles really make it seem like it's this last-minute copy-and-paste job.
Uh-huh. I will say, too, you mentioned an interview with one of your customers. I find that to be a very common request, and that might be something you want to think about going into this, is knowing who you're going to ask in your mind, maybe 2-3 of your customers that would be willing to do something like that. Because whenever we've had an article, like, they interview us and they maybe take like half a sentence from what we say, but to kind of support the idea of how floating is helping people and stuff like that, they really seem to want quotes from your actual float customers, which makes sense. I mean, that's a much more credible, like, business owner says his business is excellent, like it doesn't, obviously it's not exactly how a very, respectable way to write an article. So yeah, keeping that in mind as you go into this and knowing who might be good candidates to reach out to in your customer base for that is definitely some good prep you can do.
And again, this is all a really good base to get you started. Fortunately, getting press written about you is not unique to float tanks as well.
Right.
So there's tons of great material out there, even down to really what newspapers and magazines are looking for in an exact word count and kind of content-wise, paragraph-wise from a press release that you write. So definitely do a little follow-up research and just kind of keep the general lessons from this in mind. And hopefully that helps you navigate the silent sea of sending out these press releases.
Yeah. All right. Well, excellent. If you guys have any more questions for us that you want us to see answered on this podcast, you can just go to floattanksolutions.com/podcast or send us an email or,
Do a smoke signal. We'll be looking to the east from now on out.
just write it on a rock and throw it through a window, like anything, it's all good.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Bye.